The ink had stained her fingers black for so long that Hannah Orwell had forgotten what her natural skin looked like. And as she sat hunched over the makeshift desk in the corner of the abandoned mining shack outside Breckenridge, Colorado, in the summer of 1877, she wondered if God himself would recognize the devotion in every cramped letter she painstakingly copied from the worn Bible before her. The altitude made her head pound, and her lungs work harder than they should, but hunger was a fiercer master than thin mountain air. She had been copying the scriptures for 3 months now, selling individual pages to travelers and townsfolk who wanted a piece of the Holy Word but could not afford a complete Bible of their own. A single page brought her enough coins for bread, and sometimes a bit of dried meat if the buyer felt generous. Her father had died in a cave 2 years prior, one of dozens of miners who chased silver dreams into the belly of the mountains and never came back out. Her mother had followed him 6 months later, her body simply giving up after her heart had already broken. Hannah had been 19 then, alone in a mining town that chewed up the weak and spat them out before winter could finish the job. She had tried taking in laundry, but the other women had established their territories and their customer bases long before she arrived at desperation's door. She had tried cooking, but the boarding houses had their own staff and saw no reason to add another mouth to feed. The general store had turned her away, the saloon had offered her work she would rather starve than accept, and the church had provided sympathy but no employment. Then she had remembered the Bible her mother had cherished, the one possession of value they had owned, its leather cover worn soft by devoted hands. Hannah could write with a neat, careful hand. Her mother had taught her letters when she was small, an unusual gift for a mining family. But her mother had come from better circumstances back east before love had led her into the mountains. Hannah had practiced by copying her mother's recipes and her father's simple letters to relatives they would never see again. The idea had come to her during a particularly vivid dream where her mother stood in golden light and pointed to the Bible on the shelf. So Hannah had begun her work. She copied Genesis first, selling Adam and Eve's story to a prospector who wanted to send something meaningful to his sister in Kansas. She copied Psalms for a widow who clutched the page to her chest and wept. She copied Proverbs for a merchant who wanted wisdom to guide his business dealings. Each page took hours, sometimes an entire day if the passage was long or her hand cramped too severely to continue. She used whatever paper she could find or afford, sometimes old ledger pages with numbers on the back, sometimes proper writing paper when a sale had been particularly profitable. Her ink she made herself from soot and water and tree sap, the recipe learned from an old Chinese man who had worked the railroads and now lived on the edges of town where nobody bothered him. The work was destroying her eyes and her hands, but it kept her alive. Barely. She had lost weight she could not afford to lose, her dresses hanging loose on a frame that had never been robust to begin with. Her hair, once a rich chestnut brown, had grown dull from poor nutrition. Her skin had taken on a transparency that spoke of too many meals skipped, too many nights shivering in a shack with gaps in the walls that let in the mountain cold. But she kept writing, kept forming the holy words letter by letter, because the alternative was unthinkable. The sound of a horse approaching made her look up from the page where she was halfway through Ecclesiastes, a book that felt particularly relevant to her circumstances with its meditations on the vanity of human striving. Few people came this far up the mountain path. Her shack sat a good mile from town, abandoned after the mine it had served played out and left the workers to scatter like leaves before wind. She had claimed it through simple occupation, and nobody had challenged her right to live in a place nobody else wanted. The horse stopped outside. Footsteps approached, heavy boots on rocky ground. Hannah quickly cleaned her pen and closed the Bible, protective of its pages even as she prepared to defend the only home she had. The door, which hung crooked on leather hinges, scraped open without the courtesy of a knock. The man who filled the doorway was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dusty trail clothes and wearing a gun belt that had seen considerable use. His hat was pushed back to reveal sun-weathered features and eyes the color of a winter sky, pale blue and sharp with intelligence. He was perhaps 25 or 26, old enough to have earned the hard edge that showed in his stance, but young enough that his face had not yet fully settled into the lines that harder years would carve. "This is private property," Hannah said, rising to her feet and immediately regretting it as dizziness washed through her from standing too quickly. She gripped the edge of her desk to steady herself. The man's eyes tracked the movement, then swept across the shack's interior, taking in the sparse furnishings, the stack of finished pages weighted down by a rock, the Bible, the ink-stained fingers she could not hide. His expression remained neutral, but something shifted in his gaze. "Name's Kane Foster," he said, his voice carrying the rough edges of someone who spent more time talking to horses than people. "I heard in town there's a woman up here who sells scripture pages. I'm looking to buy." Hannah studied him carefully, trying to determine if he was genuine, or if this was some new form of trouble she would need to navigate. Men did not often come to her with honest intentions. The town believed she must be running some sort of confidence scheme, because surely no one could survive on the pennies that scripture pages brought. The assumption about what else she must be selling had been whispered often enough that it had reached even her isolated ears. "I sell pages," she confirmed, keeping her voice level and her distance from him. "A chapter costs 10 cents. A full book costs 50 cents. Payment in advance." Kane Foster reached into his pocket and Hannah tensed, but he only pulled out a leather coin purse. He counted out 5 silver dollars and placed them on the desk with a solid clink of metal on wood. "What will that buy me?" he asked. Hannah stared at the money. $5. That was more than she typically made in a month. It was enough to buy real food, enough to purchase proper paper and ink, enough to repair the worst of the gaps in her walls before autumn turned bitter. "That would buy you 10 complete books," she said slowly, suspicion creeping into her tone. "Or 50 chapters of your choosing." "What exactly are you looking for?" "I want you to stop," Kane said bluntly. "For a week. Stop copying and use that money to eat something before you fall over." The words hit her like a physical blow. Hannah felt her face flush with humiliation and anger. "I do not need your charity, Mr. Foster. If you are not here to make a legitimate purchase, please leave." "It is a legitimate purchase," Kane said, not moving from where he stood. "I'm buying you time. Consider it a commission. In 1 week I'll come back and I want you to have written something for me, not scripture. Something of your own words." "I do not understand," Hannah said, shaking her head. "Why would you want that?" Kane picked up one of her finished pages from the stack, examining it with care. "I can't read," he admitted quietly. "Never learned my letters, but I know quality work when I see it. The reverend in town showed me one of your pages. Said your handwriting was the finest he'd ever seen, better than the printed Bibles back east. Said each letter was formed with love." He set the page down gently and met her eyes. "I have a brother in Texas. Haven't seen him in 8 years. I want to send him a letter telling him I'm still alive, that I think about him, that I hope he's doing well. But I can't write it myself, and I don't trust anyone in town to write what I want to say and not spread my business to everyone with ears. I'll tell you the words and you write them down. That's worth $5 to me." Hannah looked at the money again, then at Kane Foster's weathered face. There was no mockery in his expression, no pity that she could detect, just a straightforward honesty that she had rarely encountered since her parents died. "Why wait a week?" she asked. "Because you need to eat," Kane said simply, "and rest, and not work yourself to death over a Bible page. When I come back, I want to hire someone who can hold a pen steady, not someone who's shaking from hunger." "You have no right to tell me what to do," Hannah said, but the words lacked heat. She was too tired and too hungry to muster proper outrage. "You're right," Kane agreed. "I don't, but the money's there regardless. Use it or don't. I'll be back in a week either way." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "There's a widow named Mrs. Chen who runs a kitchen out of her house on the east side of town. She'll feed you proper for a fair price and won't ask questions. Tell her I sent you." Then he was gone, the sound of his boots fading, his horse carrying him back down the mountain path. Hannah stood alone in her shack, staring at the $5 on her desk as if they might vanish like morning frost under scrutiny. Her stomach cramped with hunger, making the decision for her. She picked up the coins, feeling their weight, their reality. She allowed herself one day to consider whether this was wise, whether accepting Kane Foster's strange commission would lead to complications she could not afford. But hunger was a persuasive counselor, and by the next morning she was walking into town with the money tucked safely in the pocket she had sewn into the lining of her dress. Mrs. Chen's kitchen was exactly where Kane had indicated, a small house that smelled of cooking spices and steamed rice. The widow herself was a tiny woman with silver-streaked black hair and hands that moved with efficient grace. When Hannah explained that Kane Foster had sent her, the old woman's stern expression softened slightly. "Mr. Kane is good man," she said in heavily accented English. "You eat, I cook." The meal Mrs. Chen set before her was simple but abundant. Rice and vegetables, thin slices of pork in a savory sauce, tea that actually had flavor instead of being the exhausted remnants of leaves used too many times. Hannah ate slowly, forcing herself not to make sick by overwhelming a stomach that had grown accustomed to deprivation. Mrs. Chen watched her with knowing eyes and packed up additional food without being asked, refusing to take payment for anything beyond the single meal. "You come back tomorrow," the old woman commanded. "You too thin. Not healthy." Hannah did return the next day and the day after that. She bought proper paper and fresh ink from the general store, where the clerk raised his eyebrows but took her money without comment. She purchased a warm shawl from the seamstress, who had a small shop above the hardware store. She found a carpenter willing to trade an afternoon's labor for 3 pages of scripture, and came home to a shack with walls that no longer whistled with wind and a door that actually closed properly. By the end of the week, Hannah felt more human than she had in months. The constant ache in her belly had subsided. Her hands were steadier. She had even regained some small measure of hope, though she was careful not to trust it too far. Hope was a dangerous luxury for someone in her position. Kane Foster returned exactly when he said he would, arriving in the afternoon when the mountain sun slanted through her now properly covered windows. Hannah had prepared for his visit by setting out her best paper and making fresh ink. She had even made tea from real leaves, a gesture of hospitality that felt strange after so long alone. "You look better," Kane said without preamble, accepting the chair she offered and the cup of tea she poured. His pale blue eyes studied her face with an attention that made her self-conscious. "Got some color back." "Your money was well spent," Hannah replied, settling herself at her desk with pen poised over paper. "Now tell me what you want to say to your brother and I will write it down." Kane removed his hat and turned it in his hands, a gesture that suggested nervousness despite his otherwise confident demeanor. "His name is Joseph Foster. Last I knew, he was in a town called Redemption, south of San Antonio. Don't know if he's still there." He paused, gathering words. "Start with Dear Joseph." Hannah wrote the salutation in her careful script, then waited. Kane's voice, when he continued, had lost some of its rough edge. "I hope this letter finds you well and whole. 8 years is too long for brothers to be apart, and not a day passes that I don't think about you and wonder if you're still telling terrible jokes and getting into trouble the way you used to." Hannah's pen moved across the page, transforming his spoken words into elegant written form. Kane watched the process with fascination, his eyes tracking each letter as it appeared. "I'm in Colorado now, working as a foreman for a cattle operation near Breckenridge. The work is honest and the pay is steady. I have a small house on the ranch property and a good horse named Dusty who only tries to throw me on Mondays." A small smile touched Kane's lips at that, and Hannah found herself smiling too as she wrote. "I know we parted on hard terms after Pa died," Kane continued, his voice going quieter. "I know you wanted to stay in Kansas and I wanted to leave. I know I said things I shouldn't have said, things about duty and cowardice that weren't fair and weren't true. I've had 8 years to regret those words, Joseph. I was 20 years old and angry at the world for taking our father and leaving us alone. I took that anger out on you, and you didn't deserve it." Hannah paused her writing to look up at Kane. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on something beyond the walls of the shack. "Should I write that exactly as you said it?" she asked gently. "Yes," Kane said firmly. "He needs to hear it, I need to say it." She continued writing as Kane spoke. "If you're willing, I would like to see you again. I would like to meet whoever you've become in these 8 years. I would like to be brothers again if that's possible. If you want nothing to do with me, I'll understand and I won't bother you further, but I had to try. Life is too short and too uncertain not to try." Kane fell silent, then added, "End with your brother, Kane." Hannah completed the letter with a flourish on the final word, then carefully blotted the ink and held up the page for Kane to see. "Does this look acceptable?" Kane leaned forward to study the page, his expression awed despite not being able to read the words. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. "He'll know someone put care into this, that it mattered." "It's a good letter," Hannah said, meaning it. "Honest and heartfelt. I hope your brother responds well." "So do I," Kane said. He pulled out his coin purse again. "What do I owe you for this?" Hannah hesitated. The $5 had been more than generous for a single letter's commission. To charge more felt like taking advantage. "The $5 you already paid is more than sufficient," she said. Kane frowned. "That was for you to rest and eat. This is for the work. How much do you charge for a letter?" "I've never written a letter for someone before," Hannah admitted. "Only scripture." "Then set a price now," Kane said. "If you're going to do this work, you need to value it properly." Hannah considered. A simple scripture page brought her 5 to 10 cents depending on length. This letter was longer than most single pages and had required active listening and translation of spoken word to written form. 25 cents, she suggested tentatively. Kane placed a silver dollar on the desk. "That's my price. For a letter this important, written this well, $1 is more than fair. And I'll tell you something else, Miss Orwell. There are plenty of men in these mountains who can't read or write, who have people they need to reach but no way to do it. You could make a real living writing letters, not just surviving on scripture pennies." The idea had not occurred to Hannah, but now that Kane had spoken it aloud, she saw the possibility. "People would come to me for such a service. If they knew it existed, yes," Kane said. "With your permission, I'll spread the word at the ranch. We've got 40 men working there, and I'd wager half of them can barely sign their own names. They've got mothers and siblings and sweethearts they'd like to write to if they could. And you trust them to come all the way up here?" Hannah asked. "To conduct business honestly with a woman alone," Kane's expression hardened. "Any man who works for the outfit I work for knows how to behave respectfully, or they don't work there long. But if it would make you feel safer, you could set up in town. Rent a small space, work regular hours where people can see you're running a legitimate business." Hannah bit her lip, thinking. The idea of leaving her shack, of integrating back into town life, was both appealing and terrifying. She had grown accustomed to isolation, to the safety of having no one close enough to judge or harm her. "I cannot afford to rent space in town," she said finally. "The old assay office has been empty for 2 years," Kane said. "The owner lives in Denver now. I know him. I could arrange for you to use it in exchange for sending him regular letters about how the town is doing. He likes to keep informed about his investments here, but he's too busy to visit often." "You would do that?" Hannah asked, surprised. Kane shrugged. "I'm good at solving problems." "Right now, you're a problem that needs solving." "I am not a problem," Hannah said, bristling slightly. "Poor choice of words," Kane admitted. "You're a talented person in a bad situation who deserves better. Is that more acceptable?" Hannah studied him, trying to understand what motivated this strange cowboy who had walked into her life with silver dollars and unexpected opportunities. "Why are you helping me? You do not know me." Kane met her gaze steadily. "Because someone should. And because I know what it's like to be alone and struggling and too proud to ask for help. I've been there. I survived it. Now I'm in a position to make things a little easier for someone else, and Scripture says that's what we're supposed to do for each other." The irony of him quoting Scripture, even generally, while admitting he could not read, was not lost on Hannah. She felt something shift in her chest, some small defensive wall beginning to crack. "If you can truly arrange for me to use the assay office, I would be grateful," she said carefully. "And I would be willing to write letters for your ranch workers, or anyone else who needs the service." "Good," Kane said, standing and settling his hat back on his head. "I'll talk to the owner by telegraph this week. In the meantime, would you be willing to come down to the ranch next Sunday? I could introduce you to some of the men, let them know what you're offering. We usually have a communal meal on Sunday afternoons. You'd be welcome to join us." The invitation surprised her. Social occasions had been scarce in Hannah's recent life, and the thought of being surrounded by 40 ranch workers was daunting. But it was also an opportunity to establish the customer base Kane had described. "I will come," she agreed. "Thank you for the invitation." Kane smiled then, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered features and made him look younger, less hardened by whatever experiences had marked him. "I'll come fetch you Sunday morning, around 10 o'clock. After he left, Hannah sat at her desk for a long time, staring at the silver dollar he had paid her and thinking about the strange turn her life had taken. 1 week ago she had been slowly starving, copying Scripture with hands that shook from weakness. Now she had food in her belly, repairs to her home, and the possibility of a real future doing work that did not require her to sacrifice her health and eyesight letter by painful letter. She picked up her mother's Bible and opened it to a random page, a habit she had developed when seeking comfort or guidance. The pages fell open to Proverbs, and her eyes landed on a verse she had copied many times. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths." Perhaps, Hannah thought, Kane Foster was a path being directed to her, or perhaps she was being directed to him. Either way, she felt the stirring of something that might have been gratitude, or might have been the beginning of hope taking root despite her caution. Sunday arrived with clear skies and temperatures warm enough that Hannah did not need her new shawl, though she wore it anyway because it was the nicest thing she owned. She had washed her dress as best she could and braided her hair in a neat plait down her back. Her reflection in the small mirror she owned showed someone who still looked too thin, but no longer appeared to be at death's door. It would have to be sufficient. Kane arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, riding his horse Dusty and leading a gentle mare he introduced as Clover. "Borrowed her from the stable for you," he explained, helping Hannah mount with a care that suggested he was aware of her still fragile strength. "She's calm and knows the way." The ride down to the ranch took 40 minutes, winding through mountain paths that offered spectacular views of the valley below. Breckenridge spread out like a scatter of wooden blocks beside the Blue River, smoke rising from chimneys, and the stamp mill visible even at this distance. Beyond the town, the cattle ranch occupied a broad meadow where grass grew thick enough to support the large herds Kane described as they rode. "We run about 3,000 head," he explained. "Mostly shorethorns brought up from Texas, though the boss has been experimenting with some Angus breeding stock from back east. I manage the day-to-day operations, coordinate the hands, handle disputes, plan the rotations for grazing. It's good work." "How did you come to this position?" Hannah asked, genuinely curious. "Ranch foreman seems like a role that requires significant experience." Kane was quiet for a moment. "I worked my way up. Started as a trail hand in Kansas when I was 16, right after my father died. Spent 4 years driving cattle from Texas to the railheads, learning everything I could about livestock and land management. When I came to Colorado, the boss here saw I had ambition and skill. He took a chance on me. I've been foreman for 2 years now." "Do you enjoy it?" Hannah asked. "Most days," Kane said honestly. "It's hard work and long hours, but I like having responsibility. I like building something that matters. These men depend on me to make good decisions, and the cattle depend on all of us to keep them healthy and fed. There's satisfaction in that." They arrived at the ranch to find preparations for the Sunday meal already underway. The ranch house itself was a sprawling structure of weathered wood and stone, built to withstand mountain winters and house the owner's family when they were in residence. Near it stood a bunkhouse where the single men lived, and scattered across the property were several small cabins for married workers and those with families. Kane helped Hannah dismount and guided her toward a large open area where tables had been set up under the shade of several large cottonwood trees. Women were already bringing out food, and children ran between the tables in some complicated game that involved much laughter and shouting. The scene was so vibrantly alive, so full of community and connection, that Hannah felt momentarily overwhelmed. "You all right?" Kane asked quietly, his hand hovering near her elbow without actually touching. "It's just been a long time since I was around so many people," Hannah admitted. "You can leave whenever you want," Kane assured her. "No pressure, but I think you'll find folks here are decent." He was right. Over the course of the afternoon, Hannah met a steady stream of ranch workers and their families. Kane introduced her as Miss Orwell, a professional letter writer who could help them communicate with distant loved ones. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. A young cowboy barely out of his teens asked if she could write to his mother in Missouri. An older man with a heavily scarred face wanted to send a letter to his daughter in California. A married couple asked if she could help them write to the husband's brother about the birth of their first child. Hannah took notes, collecting names and details, and promised to have the letters ready within the week. Several people paid her in advance, pressing coins into her hand with gratitude that seemed disproportionate to the service she was offering. But as she listened to their stories, their desires to connect with family they had left behind in pursuit of work and survival, she began to understand the value of what she could provide. These were people whose lives did not allow for formal education, whose childhoods had been spent working rather than learning letters. But they had the same needs for connection and communication as anyone else, and Hannah could be the bridge that linked them to the people they loved. The meal itself was abundant. Roasted beef and potatoes, fresh bread, beans cooked with bacon, dried apple pie with cream. Hannah ate modestly, still careful not to overwhelm her recovering system, but savored every bite. She sat at a table with Kane and several of his senior hands, listening to their conversation about cattle diseases and market prices, and the best routes for moving herds to winter pastures. "You're quiet," Kane observed at one point, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I'm listening," Hannah replied, "learning. This world is very different from what I've known." "What did you know before?" Kane asked. "Before your parents passed, I mean." Hannah traced the rim of her tin cup with one finger. "My father worked the mines. We lived in a small cabin closer to town. My mother kept house and tried to make a home despite the roughness of the place. She had been educated back east, taught me to read and write and do sums. She hoped I might become a teacher someday, or marry someone who could provide a comfortable life." "Those are reasonable hopes," Kane said. "They died with her," Hannah said simply. "When my parents were gone, I had no family, no prospects, and no skills that anyone valued enough to pay for, except copying scripture, and even that barely kept me alive." Kane was quiet for a moment. "You have skills now that people value. You've got a future, Hannah, a real one." The use of her first name surprised her, but she did not correct him. In the afternoon sunlight, surrounded by the noise and warmth of community, it felt natural rather than presumptuous. "Thanks to you," she said softly. "Thanks to your own abilities," Kane corrected. "I just pointed you in the right direction. You're the one doing the work." Over the following weeks, Hannah's life transformed in ways she could not have imagined during those desperate days of copying scripture, until her vision blurred and her fingers cramped. Kane made good on his promise regarding the assay office. The owner agreed to let her use the space rent-free, in exchange for weekly letters keeping him informed about Breckenridge's business developments. Hannah moved her few possessions into town, setting up the office with a proper desk, shelves for her supplies, and a small sitting area where clients could wait if she was occupied. Word spread quickly about her services. In addition to writing letters, Hannah began offering to read correspondence for those who received mail but could not decipher it themselves. She helped fill out forms for land claims and business licenses. She transcribed verbal contracts into written agreements. She even began teaching basic reading and writing to a small group of children whose parents wanted them to have opportunities for education that the town's intermittent school could not provide. The income was not lavish, but it was steady and honest. Hannah could afford decent meals, proper clothing, fuel for heat as autumn deepened into winter. She could afford to maintain her office and purchase quality supplies. She could even save small amounts against future uncertainties, building a financial cushion that represented security she had thought lost forever. Through it all, Kane Foster remained a steady presence in her life. He visited the office regularly, sometimes to have her write letters for his ranch hands, sometimes simply to check that she was managing well. He brought her small gifts that suggested he was paying attention to her needs and preferences. A warmer lamp when the days grew short, a cushion for her chair when he noticed she was developing back pain from long hours at her desk, a book of poetry when he overheard her mention missing the pleasure of reading for enjoyment rather than work. You cannot keep giving me things, Hannah protested after the poetry book, though she clutched it to her chest like treasure. Why not? Kane asked, leaning against her doorframe with his arms crossed and an expression of amusement on his weathered face. Because it's not proper, Hannah said, though the words lacked conviction. People will talk. People already talk, Kane pointed out. They say you're too pretty to be unmarried. They say you're too smart to be wasting your talents on letter writing. They say I'm a fool if I do not court you properly before some other man snatches you up. Hannah's breath caught. Kane. I'm not good with fancy words, Kane said, pushing off the doorframe and taking a step closer. I can't write them and I barely know how to say them. But I know that I think about you first thing when I wake up and last thing before I sleep. I know that your happiness matters to me more than my own. I know that when I imagine my future, you're in it. We've only known each other 3 months, Hannah whispered, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he must hear it. I've known men who courted for years and still married the wrong person, Kane said. Time isn't what matters. Knowing your own heart is what matters, and I know mine. Hannah set the poetry book down carefully, needing something to do with her hands. I care about you too, she admitted quietly, but I'm afraid. Of what? Kane asked gently. Of depending on someone and losing them, Hannah said, the words spilling out before she could stop them. I depended on my parents and they died. I depended on the mine to employ my father and it killed him. I depended on finding work and nearly starved. I've learned that the only person I can truly depend on is myself. Kane closed the distance between them and carefully, giving her time to pull away if she wished, took both her hands in his. His palms were calloused and warm, his grip firm but gentle. I can't promise I'll never die, he said honestly. None of us can promise that. But I can promise that while I'm alive, I'll do everything in my power to keep you safe and cared for. I can promise that you'll never be alone again unless you choose to be. I can promise that your struggles will be my struggles, and we'll face them together. Hannah looked up into his pale blue eyes and saw nothing but sincerity. You barely know me, she said, but her protest was weakening. Then let me know you better, Kane said. Court you properly. Take time to build something real and lasting. I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow, Hannah. I'm asking for the chance to prove that I'm worth trusting. Hannah thought about the months since Kane had walked into her shack with $5 silver and a commission for a letter. He had been consistent in his care, thoughtful in his assistance, respectful of her autonomy while offering support she desperately needed. He had never asked for anything in return, never suggested that his help came with expectations or obligations. He had simply been present, steady, reliable. All right, she said softly. Court me properly. Let us see where this leads. Kane's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, brilliant and transformative. He lifted her hands to his lips and kissed her knuckles with old-fashioned courtesy that made her heart flutter. You won't regret this, he promised. I hope not, Hannah said, but she was smiling too. The courtship that followed was unlike anything Hannah had imagined in her girlhood dreams of romance. Kane was not flowery or poetic in his affections. He did not serenade her with songs or write her love sonnets, though he did hire her to write letters to his brother Joseph with increasing regularity as the two men rebuilt their relationship across the distance between Colorado and Texas. Instead, Kane showed his care through actions and presence. He came to her office every day, timing his visits to coincide with her lunch hour so they could eat together. Sometimes he brought food from Mrs. Chen's kitchen. Sometimes they walked to the small restaurant near the hotel. They talked during these meals, sharing stories of their pasts and their hopes for the future. Hannah learned that Kane had grown up on a small farm in Kansas. that his mother had died when he was young, that his father had been a stern but loving man whose death from illness had left Kane and Joseph orphaned and struggling. Joseph wanted to keep the farm, Kane explained one afternoon as they sat on a bench outside her office, watching the traffic of people and horses move through the street. He thought if we just worked hard enough, we could make it succeed where our father had failed. But I saw the debt we were drowning in, the way the land was playing out, the reality that two young men with no capital and no credit were not going to magically turn things around. "So you left," Hannah said. "So I left," Kane confirmed. "And I told Joseph he was a fool to stay. Told him he was wasting his life on a dream that was already dead. We fought, said terrible things, and I walked away. 8 years of silence because I was too stubborn and too proud to admit I might have been wrong." "Were you wrong?" Hannah asked. Kane was quiet for a long moment. "Yes and no. Leaving was the right choice for me. It allowed me to learn and grow and eventually find work I'm good at. But the way I left was wrong. The things I said were wrong. Joseph deserved better than his older brother abandoning him and calling him a coward for choosing a different path." "You've apologized in your letters," Hannah pointed out. "He's responded kindly. The relationship is mending." "Thanks to you," Kane said, turning to look at her. "You made it possible for me to say what needed to be said. Those letters have given me back my brother, Hannah." "That's a debt I can never repay." "It is not a debt," Hannah insisted. "It is my work and you paid fairly for it." "It's more than work," Kane said firmly. "But if you want to see it as just business, I won't argue." Hannah nudged him with her shoulder, a gesture of affection that was becoming more natural between them. "Tell me something else. Tell me something you have not shared before." Kane thought for a moment. "I want children someday, at least 3 or 4. I want a house full of noise and laughter and chaos. I want to give them the kind of childhood I had before my mother died, where they feel safe and loved and full of possibility." The admission made Hannah's heart squeeze. "That is a beautiful dream." "What about you?" Kane asked. "What do you want that you have not said?" Hannah considered carefully. "I want security," she said finally. "Not wealth necessarily, but the confidence that I will not go hungry again, that I will not be one disaster away from losing everything. I want work that matters and is appreciated. I want a home that feels permanent, not temporary. And yes, I think I would like children too, someone to teach and nurture the way my mother taught and nurtured me." "Those seem like compatible dreams," Kane observed. "They do," Hannah agreed, and the possibility inherent in that agreement settled between them like a promise. As autumn deepened and the aspens turned gold against the evergreen mountains, Kane began taking Hannah on rides through the countryside on Sunday afternoons when the weather allowed. They would pack simple meals and ride to scenic overlooks where they could see for miles across the valleys and peaks. Kane taught her about the land, pointing out the markers that indicated good grazing territory, explaining the challenges of maintaining livestock at altitude, sharing his knowledge with a passion that made clear how much he loved his work. Hannah reciprocated by reading to him during these outings, bringing the poetry book he had gifted her, or sometimes newspapers from Denver that contained serialized stories. She watched his face as she read, seeing how the words transported him, gave him access to worlds and ideas he could not reach on his own. Once, impulsively, she asked if he would like her to teach him to read. Kane was silent for so long she thought she had offended him. Then he said quietly, "I'd like that. I've always been ashamed that I never learned. My father tried to teach me, but I was restless and impatient, and then he got sick and there was no time. By the time I was on my own, I was too busy surviving to worry about letters." "It's never too late to learn," Hannah said firmly. "If you're willing to be patient with the process, I'm willing to teach you." So their courtship took on an additional dimension as Hannah began giving Kane reading lessons during their time together. They started with the alphabet, Kane carefully copying letters onto the small slate Hannah brought from her office. His hands, so competent with rope and reins and cattle, fumbled with the chalk, but he persisted with a determination that touched Hannah's heart. Letter by letter, word by word, Kane began to decipher the written language that had been mysterious to him for 26 years. The first time he successfully read a complete sentence, his face lit with such joy that Hannah impulsively kissed him. It was their first kiss, spontaneous and sweet, and when they pulled apart both of them were blushing and smiling like teenagers. "Well," Kane said, his voice slightly breathless, "if that is the reward for reading, I'll be motivated to learn very quickly." Hannah laughed, feeling lighter and happier than she could remember. "You'll have to earn more kisses through good behavior, Mr. Foster." "Then I'll be on my best behavior always," Kane promised, and kissed her again, more slowly this time, with an intensity that made Hannah's toes curl in her boots. Winter came to the mountains with fierce determination, burying Breckenridge under snow and making travel difficult. Hannah's business slowed as people ventured out less frequently, but she had planned for the seasonal decline and had savings to carry her through. Kane visited her office daily regardless of weather, sometimes arriving covered in snow after riding down from the ranch in conditions that would have kept less determined men indoors. "You should not risk yourself in these storms," Hannah scolded him one particularly brutal afternoon, when he arrived with icicles forming in his beard and his coat frozen stiff. "I need to know you're safe," Kane said, stamping snow from his boots and moving close to the small stove that heated her office. "The town's cut off from the ranch when the storms are bad. If something happened to you, I wouldn't know for days." "Nothing is going to happen to me," Hannah assured him, but she was secretly touched by his concern. "I'm warm and well-fed and perfectly capable of managing on my own." "I know you are," Kane said, "but that doesn't mean you should have to." It was during one of these winter visits that Kane mentioned the ranch owner was planning to sell his operation and move permanently to Denver. "His wife's health isn't good at altitude," Kane explained. "They're looking for a buyer who'll keep the operation running and retain the current staff." "What will you do if a new owner wants to bring in their own foreman?" Hannah asked, worried. "I have some savings," Kane said. "Enough that I've been thinking about making an offer myself, not for the whole operation but for a portion of the land. Enough to run a smaller herd, maybe 200 or 300 head, build my own place instead of working for someone else." Hannah stared at him. "That is a significant undertaking." "It is," Kane agreed, "but I'm ready for it. I've learned the business from the ground up. I know what works at this altitude and what doesn't. I have relationships with buyers and suppliers, and I have reason to want my own place now." He looked at her meaningfully, and Hannah felt her heart begin to race. "Kane," she said carefully, "are you saying what I think you're saying?" Kane crossed the small office to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "Hannah Orwell, I know we've only been courting for a few months. I know some people would say it's too soon. But I also know that every day I spend with you makes me more certain that you're the person I want to spend my life with. You're strong and smart and kind. You've survived things that would have broken other people. You've built something meaningful from nothing. And you make me want to be better than I am." He paused, swallowing hard. "I'm not asking you to marry me today, but I'm asking if you would consider it. If you would think about building a life with me on land of our own, where we could raise those children we both want and create something lasting together." Hannah felt tears prick her eyes. 6 months ago she had been starving and alone, copying scripture with shaking hands just to survive another day. Now this good man was offering her a future, a home, a partnership built on respect and affection and growing love. "I would consider it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "In fact, I don't need to consider it long. Yes, Kane. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll build a life with you." Kane surged up from his knees to pull her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that made the small office feel too warm despite the winter cold outside. Hannah kissed him back, pouring into it all the gratitude and affection and hope she had been afraid to feel for so long. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Kane rested his forehead against hers. "I promise you won't regret this," he said fiercely. "I promise I'll spend every day making sure you're happy and safe and loved." "I believe you," Hannah whispered, "and I promise the same. We'll build this life together as equals and partners." "As equals and partners," Kane agreed. They married in the spring of 1878, in a simple ceremony at the small church in Breckenridge with Mrs. Chen, and several of Kane's ranch workers serving as witnesses. Hannah wore a dress of cream-colored wool that the seamstress had created for her, simple but elegant. Kane wore his best suit, his hair neatly trimmed and his boots polished to a shine. The reverend who performed the ceremony used one of the scripture pages Hannah had copied months earlier, a passage from Corinthians about love being patient and kind. The irony was not lost on Hannah that the desperate work that had barely kept her alive had now become part of the ceremony that marked the beginning of her new life. God worked in mysterious ways, her mother used to say. Hannah was beginning to believe it. After the wedding, Kane took Hannah to see the land he had purchased. 200 acres of prime grazing territory with a creek running through it, and views of the high peaks in every direction. "I've already started building our house," he admitted, leading her on horseback to a site where the frame of a structure was taking shape. "I wanted it to be a surprise." Hannah stared at the emerging building, tears streaming down her face. It was not large or fancy, but it was solid and well planned, with a main room for living, a separate bedroom, and a small additional room that Kane shyly explained could be used for her letter-writing business, or, eventually, as a nursery. "You planned for me to continue working?" Hannah asked, surprised. "Of course," Kane said, looking confused. "Why would you stop? You're good at what you do and people need your services. Just because you're married doesn't mean you should give up work that matters to you." Hannah threw her arms around her husband's neck and kissed him soundly. "You are a remarkable man, Kane Foster." "I'm a practical man," Kane corrected. "We'll need 2 incomes while we're building the herd and establishing the operation. And even after we're profitable, why waste your skills? We'll figure out how to balance it all." They moved into the house in early summer, when the construction was complete enough to be livable even if the finishing touches were still in progress. Hannah set up her desk in the small room Kane had designated as hers, arranging her supplies and her books with care. She continued taking clients from town, riding in several days a week to maintain her office there, while also serving the ranch community that Kane was building. Because he was building a community, Kane hired 4 ranch hands to help manage the growing herd, men he had worked with before and trusted. 2 of them were married, and Kane helped them construct small cabins on the property so their families could live nearby. Hannah found herself part of a small but growing settlement, connected by mutual reliance and shared goals. Life fell into rhythms that felt both strange and wonderful after so many years of instability. Hannah rose with the sun to make breakfast for Kane before he headed out to work cattle. She spent her mornings writing letters or teaching reading lessons to the ranch children, whose parents wanted them educated. Her afternoons were dedicated to household tasks or riding into town for business. Evenings belonged to Kane. to shared meals and conversation, and the growing intimacy of marriage. Hannah had been nervous about the physical aspects of marriage, having no mother to guide her and only vague understanding gleaned from whispered conversations among other women. But Kane was patient and gentle, attentive to her comfort, and what had begun as awkward and uncertain gradually became a source of pleasure and deep connection. She loved the way he held her afterward, his work-roughened hands gentle as they traced patterns on her skin, his voice low and warm as he talked about his hopes for their future. By autumn, Hannah suspected she might be pregnant. By winter, she was certain. Kane's joy at the news was profound and touching. He became even more protective, insisting she not ride into town when the weather was poor, taking over household tasks he deemed too strenuous, bringing her tea and treats from Mrs. Chen with regularity. "I'm not made of glass," Hannah protested one evening as Kane fussed over arranging pillows behind her back while she sat in their comfortable chair near the fireplace. "I know," Kane said, "but you're carrying something precious, and I want to make sure you're both safe and comfortable." Hannah softened, taking his hand and placing it on her belly where the small swell of new life was just becoming visible. "We're fine, strong and healthy, but I appreciate your care." Their son was born in the spring of 1879, arriving after a long labor that left Hannah exhausted but triumphant. Kane, who had assisted with countless difficult animal births, was utterly useless during his wife's labor, pacing and worrying until Mrs. Chen had finally ordered him out of the house. When he was finally allowed back in to meet his son, his hands shook as he held the tiny bundle. "He's perfect," Kane whispered, staring at the baby's small face with wonder. "What should we name him?" Hannah, tired but happy, smiled up at her husband. "I thought perhaps James. It was my father's name." "James Foster," Kane said, testing the sound. "I like it. James Kane Foster." Baby James was a healthy, hungry infant who demanded constant attention. Hannah navigated new motherhood with the same determination she had brought to every other challenge in her life, learning through trial and error, and the advice of the other ranch wives. Kane was a devoted father, taking overnight feedings whenever he could so Hannah could rest, carrying James in a sling while he worked around the property, singing off key lullabies that made Hannah laugh. The ranch prospered. Kane's careful management and good instincts for cattle resulted in healthy calves and good market prices. They were able to hire additional help and expand their herd gradually. Hannah scaled back her letter-writing business but did not abandon it, working from home several mornings a week and maintaining relationships with clients who had come to depend on her services. Joseph Foster visited from Texas when James was 6 months old, the first time the brothers had seen each other in nearly 9 years. The reunion was emotional, with both men embracing tightly and then stepping back to study how time had changed each other. Joseph was shorter than Kane, but had the same pale blue eyes and weathered features. He spent 2 weeks at the ranch, getting to know Hannah and doting on his nephew, repairing the bond with Kane that had been so badly damaged by their youthful argument. "You did well for yourself," Joseph told Kane on his last evening before returning to Texas. "A good wife, a fine son, land of your own. Pa would be proud." "So would Ma," Kane said quietly. "I wish they could have met Hannah." "They'd have loved her," Joseph agreed. "Anyone with eyes can see she's special." After Joseph left, Hannah found Kane standing in the nursery, watching James sleep in his cradle. She slipped her arms around her husband's waist, leaning her cheek against his back. "You're thinking about your parents," she said softly. "And yours," Kane admitted. "Wishing they could see what we've built, wishing they knew their grandchild." "They know," Hannah said with quiet certainty. Wherever they are, whatever comes after this life they know, and they're proud of us." Kane turned to pull her into his embrace. "I love you, Hannah Foster." "I love you too," Hannah whispered against his chest. 2 years later, their second child arrived, a daughter they named Clara. She had Hannah's chestnut hair and Kane's blue eyes, and from the beginning her personality was fierce and determined. Where James had been a placid baby, Clara demanded attention and made her displeasure known if she did not receive it immediately. Kane was utterly charmed by his daughter, calling her his little wildfire. Life continued its steady progression. James grew into a thoughtful, gentle boy who loved helping his father with the horses and listening to his mother read stories in the evenings. Clara grew into a whirlwind of energy and opinions, climbing everything, questioning everything, pushing every boundary her parents set. A third child, another son named Thomas, arrived when James was 5 and Clara was 3. Hannah sometimes paused in her daily work to marvel at how drastically her life had changed from those desperate days copying scripture in a falling-down shack. She had a home that was solid and comfortable, expanded now to accommodate their growing family. She had work that mattered and brought in income. She had children who were healthy and happy and loved. Most importantly, she had Kane, her partner and best friend, the man who had walked into her life with $5 silver and refused to let her continue suffering alone. The letter-writing business evolved as the years passed. Hannah began teaching more formal classes in reading and writing, helping establish a proper school for the growing community of ranches in the area. She started a small lending library, collecting donated books and allowing families to borrow them. She wrote a regular column for the Breckenridge newspaper about life in the ranch community, creating a written record of the challenges and triumphs of mountain living. Kane's ranch continued to expand gradually, until they were running nearly 500 head of cattle and employing a dozen ranch hands. He developed a reputation for fair dealing and quality livestock, building relationships with buyers across Colorado and beyond. More importantly, he built a reputation as a good employer who treated his workers with respect and paid fair wages. The small community on their land grew to include 7 families, all of them connected by mutual support and shared purpose. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Kane surprised Hannah by presenting her with a leather-bound book. She opened it curiously to find it was a journal, but the first page contained writing in Kane's careful, still improving hand. "My dearest Hannah," the inscription read. "10 years ago I married the bravest, strongest, most remarkable woman I have ever known. This is for you to write our story, so our children and grandchildren will know where we came from and what we survived to be together. I love you more than words can say, but I am learning to say them better thanks to you. Forever yours, Kane." Hannah pressed the book to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "It's perfect," she whispered. "You're perfect," Kane corrected, pulling her into his arms. "And I thank God every day that I walked into that shack and found you. I thank God you were stubborn enough to keep coming back," Hannah said, laughing through her tears. "Even when I was too proud to accept help." "You were never too proud," Kane said firmly. "You were surviving the only way you knew how. But you were always meant for more than just survival, Hannah. You were meant to thrive." She did write their story in the journal Kane gave her, capturing the details of their meeting and courtship and the life they built together. She wrote about the ranch's growth, about each of their children, and the unique personalities they displayed. She wrote about the challenges they faced, the drought year when they nearly lost everything, the winter when James broke his arm falling from a horse, the spring when Clara disappeared for 6 terrifying hours before they found her exploring a cave system a mile from the house. But mostly, Hannah wrote about love, about the steady, enduring affection that had grown between her and Kane, deepening with each year and each shared experience. About the fierce, protective love she felt for her children, and the way Kane's love for them manifested in patient teaching and firm guidance. About the love of community they had helped foster, neighbors supporting each other through hardships and celebrating triumphs together. The years continued their steady march. James grew into a young man who shared his father's aptitude for ranching and his mother's love of learning. He left for university in Denver when he was 18, the first member of either family to pursue higher education, returning with a degree in animal husbandry that he applied to improving the ranch's breeding programs. Clara, true to her fierce nature, decided she wanted to be a doctor and pursued that dream with stubborn determination, despite the obstacles facing women in medicine. Thomas, the youngest, proved to be musically gifted and ended up teaching music in Breckenridge, while helping manage the ranch during busy seasons. More grandchildren arrived as the children married and started families of their own. James married a teacher from Denver and had 3 children. Clara married a fellow doctor and had twins. Thomas married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring property and had 4 children in rapid succession. The house Kane had built expanded multiple times to accommodate family gatherings that grew increasingly large and boisterous. Hannah continued her letter writing and teaching work well into her 50s, finally reducing her involvement as her eyesight began to fade and arthritis made long hours with a pen painful. She trained several younger women to take over the business, ensuring the community would continue to have access to the services she had provided. Kane ran the ranch until he was 65, when he turned primary control over to James while maintaining an advisory role and keeping himself busy with projects that interested him. He finally mastered reading and writing well enough to compose his own letters, though he still preferred having Hannah review them before he sent them. "You make my words sound better," he always said, even when Hannah insisted his writing was perfectly adequate. On a summer evening when they were both in their 70s, Hannah and Kane sat on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the mountains that had been the backdrop of their entire married life. 3 of their grandchildren played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the warm breeze. James was visible in the distance, checking on the cattle in the nearest pasture. Clara's twins were visiting from Denver and could be heard arguing good-naturedly inside the house about something medical. Thomas was playing piano, the sound drifting through the open windows. "Did you ever imagine this?" Hannah asked, her hand clasped in Kane's, both of them weathered by age but still strong. "When you walked into that shack to buy scripture pages?" Kane was quiet for a moment, considering. "Honestly, no. I just wanted to help someone who was suffering. But I'm glad I did. I'm glad you let me." "I almost did not," Hannah admitted. "I almost sent you away." "But you didn't," Kane said. "You took a chance. We both did." Hannah leaned her head on her husband's shoulder, comfortable in a way that only came from decades of shared life. "You told me I would not write for hunger again, and I haven't. But you gave me so much more than just freedom from hunger, Kane. You gave me a life worth living." "We gave each other that," Kane corrected gently. "You saved me as much as I saved you, Hannah. Before I met you, I was just going through the motions. Working, existing, but not really living. You taught me what it means to build something meaningful with another person. You taught me what real partnership looks like." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dropped below the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Inside the house, someone called that dinner was ready. The grandchildren ran toward the porch, demanding their grandparents come eat. James rode up and dismounted, joining the flow of family heading inside. Kane stood and offered Hannah his hand, pulling her gently to her feet. She came up more slowly than she once had, her joints stiff despite the warm weather. But she rose as she always had, meeting whatever came next with determination and grace. "Shall we go in?" Kane asked. "In a moment," Hannah said, looking out over the land they had built together, the home they had filled with love and children and purpose. "I just want to remember this. All of it. I remember it every day," Kane said softly. "Every single blessed day." They walked inside together, hand in hand, to share a meal with the family they had created. And if someone had asked Hannah in that moment whether she had any regrets about the path her life had taken, about the hardships she had endured or the chances she had taken, she would have said no without hesitation. Every struggle, every moment of desperation, every desperate prayer had led her to this point. To Kane, to family, to home. Years later, long after both Hannah and Kane had passed peacefully in their sleep within months of each other, their descendants would find the journal Kane had given Hannah on their 10th anniversary. They would read the story she had written there, the tale of a young woman copying scripture to survive, and the cowboy who had refused to let her continue suffering alone. They would read about love that had started with simple kindness and grown into something enduring and transformative. And they would understand that some of the best love stories are not about grand gestures or dramatic moments, but about two people choosing each other day after day, building something meaningful together through patience and partnership and unwavering commitment. They would understand that sometimes salvation comes not in the form of miracles from heaven, but in the form of another human being who sees your worth when you have forgotten it yourself and refuses to let you face the world alone. The journal would be passed down through generations, a family treasure that reminded them of their roots and the love that had made everything else possible. And in the margins of that journal, in Kane's improving but never quite perfect handwriting, there would be notes he had added over the years. Small comments and observations, additions to the story Hannah was telling. The final entry in the journal, written in Kane's shaking hand just days before his death, reads simply, "She copied the Bible by hand to sell pages. I said she would not write for hunger again. But what I should have said, what I hope she always knew, was that she would never be hungry for anything again. Not food, not security, not love. I spent 52 years making sure of it, and I would do it all again without hesitation. She was the best thing that ever happened to me, and loving her was the greatest privilege of my life. If there is a heaven, I will wait for her there. And if there is not, knowing her in this life was heaven enough." The ranch continued to operate for generations, always staying in the Foster family, always maintaining the values that Kane and Hannah had established. The school Hannah had helped found continued to serve the community, expanded and improved over the decades. The lending library grew into a proper town library that bore her name. And in the small cemetery on a hill overlooking the ranch, 2 headstones stood side by side, marking the resting place of Kane and Hannah Foster, beloved parents and grandparents, pillars of the community, and proof that even in the harshest circumstances, hope and love could take root and flourish. Their story became local legend, told and retold until it was difficult to separate fact from embellishment. But the core truth remained unchanged. A woman had been desperate and alone, surviving through sheer determination and faith. A man had seen her suffering and refused to ignore it. Together, they had built something lasting and meaningful, a legacy that extended far beyond their own lives. And perhaps that was the real miracle of their story. Not that Kane had saved Hannah, or that Hannah had saved Kane, but that they had chosen to save each other, every day, in ways large and small, until saving each other became simply the natural rhythm of their shared life. The mountain stood eternal witness to it all, unchanging even as the human stories at their feet bloomed and faded and bloomed again. The Blue River continued its steady flow, carving deeper channels through ancient stone. The aspens turned gold each autumn, promising beauty even in the dying of the year. And in the ranch house Kane had built and Hannah had made into a home, new generations of Fosters continued the work of living and loving and building, carrying forward the legacy of two people who had found each other in the wilderness and refused to let go. That was the story. Not of perfection, but of persistence. Not of fate, but of choice. Not of one person saving another, but of two people choosing to face the world together and discovering that together they were stronger than either could have been alone. And if someone had asked whether such a love was possible, whether two people could truly build such a life from such desperate beginnings, the answer would have been yes, because they had done it. Kane and Hannah Foster had taken broken pieces and fashioned them into something whole, something beautiful, something that endured long after they were gone. That was their gift to the generations that followed. The proof that no matter how dark the circumstances, no matter how desperate the situation, love and determination and simple human kindness could change everything. One person reaching out to another person, one hand extended in help. One refusal to accept that suffering was inevitable, or that isolation was the only option. Kane had walked into that shack expecting to buy scripture pages. Instead, he had found his future. Hannah had been preparing to copy another chapter of the Bible, just trying to survive one more day. Instead, she had found her home. And together, they had proven that sometimes the most profound changes in life begin with the simplest acts of compassion, with one person seeing another's humanity and choosing to respond to it. The sun set over the Colorado mountains, as it had every evening for millennia and would continue to do for millennia more. The cattle lowed in the distance. Children played in yards. Families gathered for evening meals. Life continued its ancient patterns, each generation learning the same lessons about love and loss, struggle and triumph, desperation and hope. And in the cemetery on the hill, two headstones stood side by side, marking the resting place of two people who had learned those lessons well and lived them faithfully. Kane and Hannah Foster, together in life, together in death, together in the memory of everyone whose lives they had touched. Their story was finished, but its echoes continued, rippling outward through time and touching lives they would never know. And perhaps that was the truest measure of a life well lived. Not the wealth accumulated or the status achieved, but the love shared and the kindness offered, and the hope passed forward to those who came after. Hannah had copied the Bible by hand to sell pages, believing it was her only option for survival. Kane had promised she would not write for hunger again, and he had kept that promise. But the real promise, the one neither of them had spoken but both had lived every day of their marriage, was simpler and more profound. You will not be alone. You will not be forgotten. You will matter and your life will have meaning, and together we will build something worth building. That was the promise. And they had kept it, faithfully and completely, until the very end.